Good morning, church family. Love seeing you guys loving on one another. It's awesome. We said that there were going to be no giveaways for fathers today, but I do have a couple things to give you guys. I'll be giving you instruction on how you ought to be loving your wives. I'll also be giving your wives instructions on how they ought to be loving you, so happy Father's Day. Before we get into it, why don't we have a word of prayer? Lord, we love you. We are so grateful, Lord, that you have shown us fatherly love to such a degree, Lord, that our hearts are overwhelmed as we think about that scripture that tells us, behold, what manner of love our Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called children of God. Lord, just to think of that you've wiped away our sin, that you've adopted us into your family, we're grateful for your love for us this morning. And Lord, as we continue in this series about talking and understanding and growing in the love of God in our own lives, we pray that you would speak to us, that you would encourage us, and that you would cause the love of God to be made manifest in our hearts, in our lives. That we could come closer, Lord, to understanding what it's like to love with the love of Jesus. We ask these things in your name. Amen. Well, we're in our fourth message this morning in the series of Knowing Love. And as we have every week, there's a set of scriptures I wanted you guys to just kind of get settled in your heart. And we're going to say it again together this morning. So if you would read with me Ephesians chapter 3, verses 17 through 19. Let's all read it out loud together. That Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the width and length and depth and height, to know the love of Christ, which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. We've been exploring on how do we become filled with the fullness of God, and it's found in the love of Jesus Christ. Our first week together, we talked about the fact that knowing love is impossible apart from knowing God, because God is not someone who merely loves. God is love. He is the source, the definition of love. And to know love for what it truly is to know God. What God does, love does. What love does, God does. And then we saw how that trickled into our relationships with other believers. That if we say that we love God, yet we hate our brother and sister in Christ, we are liars. We are deceiving ourselves to think that we could actually express love to God while we're hating a brother or sister who is right in front of us, who is practically, we have the opportunity to love with the love of God. And then last week we saw that the glue that holds it all together is when we express as Christians, as humans, as we express our love to God, that we give the love he gives to us back to him in a reciprocal relationship. When we love the Lord our God with all of our heart and soul and mind and strength, that is when love is truly perfected in us. That is when love can truly be manifested through our lives to other people. And so as we look at all of those things, today I'm going to get a little more nitty-gritty, a little more practical, and I'm going to talk about what it means to express and to know the love of Christ in probably the most vulnerable, sensitive, and arguably at times the most difficult environment to consistently demonstrate the love of Jesus Christ. And that is in the marriage relationship. This morning's statement, if you'd like to read it along with me, is simply this: knowing love is loving your spouse, and loving your spouse is knowing love. Reminds me of little Christy. She was playing with her dolls once in her room, and she wanted to sort of have a little pretend wedding. So she grabbed her teddy bear groom, and she said to the imaginary pastor, "Okay, pastor, you can read us our rights." Suddenly, Christy shifted roles from bride to pastor. She walked around to the other side, and in a deep voice she said, "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say may be held against you. You have the right to have an attorney present, and you may kiss the bride." Well, unfortunately, It's true that a lot of people enter into marriage a lot more concerned with their own rights than they are about giving up their rights in order to see their marriage thrive and be blessed. And let me tell you, if you're married, if you've been married, you know that at some point in marriage, your ability to love with a Christ-like love will be put to the test. Amen? You're gonna know really quickly when certain situations come up. Was my love merely an emotional love? Was it something, a feeling I responded to? Or when I said I do, man, I was ready to do. Come thick or thin, whether I feel it or not. Am I willing to demonstrate sacrificial, undying, self-giving love, the love of Jesus to my spouse? And if you're married, you will be tested. It's only a matter of time after you put two sinful, broken, defiled people, human beings together, that after a amount of time, she's going to act that way. He's going to say that thing. He'll pull away. She'll cling too tightly. He'll pursue another passion. She'll do whatever. And it's going to be tested. It's in those moments that we know if we choose the love of Christ, when everything in us wants to choose only what's in our best interest. That's when our love is truly put to the test. Even if you're married to someone who's just like you guys have everything in common, you get along really well, at some point, their humanity is going to rear its ugly head. And when it does, your love will be put to the test. I remember my wedding day, although honestly, most of it is still a blur. I remember a 105-degree day in the middle of July outside in Southern California. I remember hours before the wedding of wedding photos and having my face like glued in the smiling position. I couldn't get it out of. I remember feeling like I was going to pass out as I was frantically outside setting up the sound system because the person who was going to help me forgot to show up. I remember getting ready to take communion with my wife right in the middle of our wedding ceremony and going to the table only to realize that someone forgot to put the communion elements out there. So we just stood there while they played the song, you know. I remember a reception full of a bunch of people that I looked at and thought, where did all these people come from and who are they? I remember leaving my wedding so exhausted that the only thing I could think of was hopping in bed and falling asleep. And for a 24-year-old guy on his wedding night, it's typically not what you're thinking about. Of course, it was all worth it to see my bride, to make those vows and so on and so forth. But I just remember leaving thinking, man, this wedding stuff is hard. I can't wait to get married and have the hard stuff behind me. Well, I've since learned that wasn't the hard part. And I can say, though, in 13 years of marriage, the harder the battles have been, the sweeter the relationship has become. And my wife and I could tell you it's only because of one thing, and that's the love of Jesus. If it wasn't for God teaching me how to love like He loves, teaching us how to love each other like He loves, things would have not gone so well. We've all heard the famous saying, God designed marriage not to make us happy, but to make us holy. And certainly, while we've heard it a ton, it's a true statement as any statement gets. I've learned that by working in my marriage to try to stay humble, to try to keep a soft heart, being committed through the good and the bad, and walking in obedience when my flesh is trying to fight it, I've become certainly a better man over the 13 years I've been married to my wife. Sometimes the Lord has refined me through some of her weaknesses, and sometimes He's fortified me through her strengths, and vice versa. And through it all, our love has grown deeper and more full of joy and intimacy. You see, my wife and I are very different people, as some of you are, but I can tell you that the depth of our love and commitment to each other over the years has grown with every passing day, and we would both tell you it's a result of our mutual submission to Christ. And of course, there's that famous analogy that's fairly simple. The husband is on the right-hand side of the triangle. the wife on the left-hand side of the triangle, and God is at the top. And of course, as each one moves closer to the center, they move closer to one another. And it's true. I speak my story, a little bit of encouragement to you today. Those of you who are married, no matter how different or similar you might be, your marriage has the potential, listen, your marriage has the potential in Christ to not only thrive, but to become a deep well of intimacy, joy, and usefulness for God's kingdom. When you are willing and able to submit yourself and your role as a husband or a wife to the scriptural principles of God's word and allow the Lord's love to have the priority, all things are possible. And I've heard a lot of excuses in my years of pastoring from people coming into my office, people talking to me. Some say, well, Josh, that's nice for you, but you don't understand. My spouse and I are just incompatible. I always wonder what they mean when they say that. But whenever I hear that word incompatible, I can't help but think about the number one most incompatible couple in all the universe, and that is you and Jesus. We're called the bride of Christ. He is our bridegroom. Yet there's never been more an incompatible match in all of history. He's perfect. You're a sinner. He's holy. You're a wretch. He thinks one way. You think completely opposite. He loves certain things. You naturally love the opposite things. Yet, in all of it, he is still committed. He still loves. He still sacrifices. He still gives. And as a result, have we not all become more like him and become better people because of his love for us? Well, Josh, that's nice, but you don't understand. I just married the wrong person. We have nothing in common. I just married the wrong person. Well, I'll give you this. You might have married the wrong person. But if you're married, guess what? You are married to the right person. Because once you said I do, you did. And there's no such thing as a wrong person when you're married to them. You made that purchase, you jumped in that boat, and you are now married to the right person, and now your responsibility is to look to God to give you strength and love to make your marriage work. And even if it's hard and doesn't work out the way you wanted, I guarantee you one thing. He will use it to bring out Christ-like character in your life. And at the end of the day, I know this is a hard statement to hear in our culture, but at the end of the day, becoming more like Christ is much more valuable than having a happy-go-lucky, easy marriage. For it is in the hard and difficulties of our marriage that our true character is tested, and Christ works to make us more like him. So this morning, I want us to move towards the love of Jesus in our marriages. I'm going to look at a formula for a thriving, Christ-centered marriage, and it only has two ingredients. These two ingredients are this. Number one, we're going to look at the first ingredient, which is the affectionate, respectful love of a wife. And secondly, we'll look at the sacrificial, patient love of a husband. Now, as the biblical authors tend to always do, when talking about marriage, they tend to start with the wife, and then they tend to end with the brunt of responsibility and weight put on the husband's shoulders. So that's how we're going to take it today. So if you're taking notes, jot the first point down. We're going to look at number one ingredient, the affectionate, respectful love of a wife. Now, I have heard someone say once that the Bible never commands wives to love their husbands. Yeah, we know this in one sense, that Ephesians 5, Colossians 3, which we'll be looking at soon. If you'd like to turn to either of those places, go ahead. But we know this, that husbands are commanded to, quote, love their wives. And the word that they use there in the Greek, that Paul uses in the Greek, that Peter uses, is the word agape, which means a self-sacrificial, self-giving love. And it is true that there is no place in the Scripture where wives are commanded to agape love their husbands. Now, this, of course, doesn't mean that wives shouldn't love their husbands, but it does mean something else interesting, that a wife's love for her husband takes on a different shape and a different form necessarily than a husband's love for his wife. There is actually a passage that does tell wives to love their husbands. It's in Titus chapter 2, and it's in verse 4. Titus writes this, or Paul writes this to Titus. speaking about older women teaching younger women, he says this, that they admonish young women to what? Love their husbands and to love their children. So there we have it. The command for wives to love their husbands. But the word here in the Greek is interesting. It's philandros. The base Greek root of that is phileo. The word for love, which means, in this case, philandros, the love towards a husband, is to have fondness and affection for, to be friendly toward, and to wish one well. Okay? So an affectionate, fond, friendly, supportive love towards her husband. Reminds me of the 5-year-old who went to her friend and said, "My father can beat up your father," to which her friend replied, "Well, so can my mother." That's not the kind of love Paul is talking about, all right? The feisty, fighting, combative kind of love. And wives, it is important biblically for you to have a friendly and fond demeanor towards your husband and towards your children. Hey, if you give the impression that you are constantly disgusted with your husband and constantly burdened by your children, it will make things very difficult for you at home. Here's something I've learned about being a husband. A husband's identity is wrapped up in a lot in the kind of environment that is being developed under his leadership. What I mean when I say that is it's a natural tendency, and when I say natural tendency, I don't mean acceptable tendency, I don't mean biblical tendency, I mean it is a natural tendency for a husband to disengage himself from a relationship when he is doing his best to love and lead his family in the ways that he knows how, and in return, he gets nothing but complaints, constant arguments, and perpetual nagging. If you see your husband as someone who just needs to be perpetually fixed by you to rise up and become more according to your standards, rather than someone to be respected and encouraged, then you're sure to make him feel unloved. Reminds me of the day that Joe's wife asked him to go fix a leak that was in their attic. So with a hint of frustration, he kind of goes over to the attic stairs. He pulls down the attic stairs, and the ladder hits him right in the eye and gives him a big old black shiner. As he lifts himself up into the attic, his arm catches an old wire that was up there and gets scraped and gets bloody cut all the way up his arm. Well, he finally finds the leak, and he goes and he grabs a pipe, and it's all rotted out, and it busts, and it just explodes all over him. He's soaking wet. Finally gets the water turned off, makes his way back down the stairs, and on his way back down, he twists his ankle and falls to the ground. On his way back into the kitchen, black eye, bloody arm, drenched from head to toe, limping back into the kitchen, his wife looked at him and angrily shouted, "Are you wearing your best pants?" Looks like the honeymoon adrenaline finally ran out. Hey, ladies, listen. We know it's evident that your husband has some needed areas of growth. And so do you. In fact, he might legitimately need a kick in the pants or a blunt rebuke, but trust me, the way and the manner in which you speak to your husband about his weaknesses will determine whether or not he backs away or draws closer to you. Your husband needs to know by your words and your actions that you are still crazy about him, not just crazy because of him. In 2 different Proverbs, Solomon says the exact same words. Chapter 21, verse 9, and in 25:24, Solomon says, "It's better to dwell in the corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman." Where's your husband retreating off to? The corner of the housetop? Proverbs 19:13 tells us the contentions of a wife are a continual dripping. I know some of you guys are like, this is actually in the Bible? Yeah. I only say this as an encouragement, as an exhortation. Ladies, don't nag your husbands. Your lips, your words, your actions have an intense power over his identity, more than you even know. I recently had a dripping faucet in our house, and I'm not talking about my wife. We had a dripping faucet in our house. The pipes were leaking. You know how that made me feel? Discouraged. I got to go find the source of the leak, get under the sink, get wet and dirty. And then you realize you have one of your best friends who's visiting you, who's a contractor, so he just does it all for you, and you just kind of stand there over watching him, Thanks, Adam, I appreciate that. But when I was thinking about this, at the end of the day, it's true. The husband is responsible to take responsibility for the state of his marriage. But he will do so with a very discouraged heart and attitude if his wife is a constant source of dripping complaints rather than a source of encouragement. Wives, I encourage you to use words to build up your husband. And in the times where you have to speak in love, in truth, about difficult things facing your family or difficult things about how you're feeling about your relationship, do it in a way that doesn't insult his manhood. Well, if you weren't such a lousy provider, well, if you would get your act together, we wouldn't be having these problems. Why can't you ever seem to care or do things right around here? Those are not words that affirm a husband. The woman in Proverbs 31, the virtuous wife, in verse 26, we're told that she opens her mouth with wisdom, and on her tongue is the law of kindness. So love can be shown from a wife to her husband in how she speaks, in what she says, in the manner of how she acts towards him. But Scripture also tells us that love can be shown from a wife to a husband in how she follows her husband's leadership. If you're there, read with me. Colossians chapter 3, it will also be on the screen. Verse 18 says this: Wives, submit to your own husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Wives, submit to your own husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Now, I know you guys hear this word submit. It's like Josh just said the S word, right? And it's just, I don't know, I don't like that word. And partially it's because of our culture. Partially we live in a culture that increasingly wants to be free from any type of authority, right? It's not just about wives. When any of us hear that we're supposed to submit to another person or even to the Lord, sometimes we fight against that. It's our human nature. But here's what the term actually means in the New Testament. Submit means, it's a military term. It means to come under rank or to order oneself under. The analogy that one of my pastors always used to use for us was that marriage is like walking in a storm under an umbrella. And the husband carries the umbrella, and the wife needs to stay under the umbrella of her husband. And it's a pretty neat analogy, and we tend to shrink away from it again. But in marriage, the Bible's clear. Someone needs to have the final responsibility for leading the marriage. It's going to happen. If no one takes a role, one of them will. I know there's a lot of talk about, it's 50-50, everything's even, but practically that's never the case. Someone leads and someone follows. And for whatever reason, sometimes totally confuses me why God chose within the marriage that the man, the husband, leads and the woman is to follow. It's what I call an ordered equality. The key here to understanding this principle is when you think about the Godhead, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Trinity. Within the Godhead, within the Trinity, there is an ordered equality. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit are all equal. They're all equally God. They're all equally valuable in their roles. And yet, when we read the Scripture, we see an ordered equality. The Father giving up His Son for the sake of the world. The Son always submitting to the will of the Father. The Spirit, in turn, always seeking to glorify the Son. They're all equal. They're all of the same value. They're all of the same purpose. And yet, there is an order in which they submit one to another. So for the wife to be submitted to her husband's leadership does not speak of difference in value or equality. Okay, we're not talking about gender inequality or gender equality or anything like that. This has to do with their role within the marital relationship. It's the role of being a helpmate and a support in following her husband's leadership. A wife coming under the leadership of her husband is not devaluing her contribution to the marriage. Neither is it meaning that she is less than, as though she's to be trampled over as some sort of slave that only exists to serve her husband's own selfish desires. In fact, we go as far to say if a wife feels like that, it's not her responsibility and her submission, but it's a result of maybe some bad leadership from her husband, which we'll get to in a moment. But notice the scope of a woman's submission within the marriage relationship. Paul says that she ought to submit to their own husbands. This clarifies the scope of submission. Not to someone else's husband, not women to men in general. It's talking about in the context of a marriage. And this is all throughout the scripture. 1 Peter chapter 3 reflects this truth. He says there, wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands. Ephesians 5:22, Paul writes this, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. There's an understanding. For whatever reason, again, God made the marriage a team. And he made the husband the captain. Ephesians 5 tells us that the marriage is like a body. The two shall become one flesh. And that who is the head of that body? The husband is the head of the body, just as Christ is the head of the church. This is how God designed it to be. And then he throws in there, make sure it's as unto the Lord. Submit to your own husbands as unto the Lord. Notice a couple things here. Number one, a wife's submission to her husband is not based on her husband's worthiness to be submitted to. Well, if you only knew my husband, if you only knew the kind of decisions he made, if you only knew how thoughtless he was. Well, Paul says it's as unto the Lord. Or as David Guzik puts it, this has nothing to do with your husband's intelligence or giftedness or capability. It has to do with honoring the Lord Jesus Christ. It's an act of worship to God. But also as unto the Lord means that a woman is never called to submit to her husband when he is outside of the Lord. In an abusive situation or in decisions that are clearly unethical or unbiblical, a wife, her first submission is always to Christ as a follower of Jesus. Now, you have to toe that line very carefully in determining what those things are and what they aren't. But nevertheless, we submit always in all relationships as unto the Lord. But here's a final thought for you guys, for you ladies, you wives. In regards to following your husband, here's something I've noticed, a pattern. If you seek to constantly lead your husband, not only will he gladly let you, kind of like Adam did in the garden at the very beginning of time, it's sort of natural for us men to yield our leadership. And it's natural for women to want to lead. But here's what happens in marriages when I see this happen. If you lead your husband, it will cause a growing insecurity in him, which will lead to a growing sense of insufficiency in him, which will lead to a growing sense of frustration for you. He will become so dependent on your leadership, on your ability to make decisions. Oh, you're always right, and it's always your way, and you're the one with the stronger opinion, and so he just yields the floor. That's ultimately going to make you frustrated. Why? Because in the times where you actually want him to lead, when you're crying out for him to rise up and be a man of God and do something, he's not going to because he's just been accustomed to this pattern. He feels insecure. He feels insufficient to lead because all of his leadership decisions are challenged, are argued against, are fought against. The best way to become content long-term in your marriage is to let your husband lead. That doesn't mean don't share your opinion. That doesn't mean don't bring wisdom to the table. That doesn't mean don't talk and mutually agree on what things are best for your family. But it means at the end of the day, you need to trust. It's an act of faith for you to trust your husband and how he desires and how he feels called to lead your family. It's very important. And it's not something you'll ever hear in our culture. You want to make your husband squirm a little bit in the midst of a family decision? Talk about it, pray about it, give your thoughts, and then look at him and smile and say, whatever you think, honey. I know you're following the Lord. I know you're seeking God. So I trust that. I certainly hope you are, because one bad decision for our family, but I'll follow you. If there's any single ladies in here, I want to speak to you just for a moment. You want to get married one day. Let this be a litmus test for you. The guy you marry will be the guy that God calls you to submit yourself to for the rest of your life. You need to ask the hard questions. Can I respect this man? Can I trust his leadership? Do I trust his relationship with the Lord? Can I follow him even when it's into places that I'd rather not go? The 19th century English novelist Mary Ann Evans wrote this: "A woman dictates before marriage in order that she may have an appetite for submission afterwards." I think that's a good rule to run by for those who are seeking to get married one day. So wives, in short, you can demonstrate Christ-like love in your marriage by how you speak, what you say, and how you follow your husband's leadership. 3 very simple yet very complicated things that the Bible teaches us about and how you can demonstrate love to your husband. But now we have to kind of flip on the other side of this coin. Husbands, how do you respond to this great challenge of God calling your wife to submit to you, to respect and honor you as a person and as a leader? What can you do to make the job of submission easy and joyful for your wife? I like to ask husbands frequently, what would it be like for you if you had to submit to a clone of yourself every day? Just think about that for a minute. If you were the one who had to be in place of submission or under rank or under the authority of yourself and your decisions and your priorities and your passions and your pursuits and how you use your time and how you spent your money, how would you feel being under that kind of leadership? Because husbands, the Bible tells us that we are the ones responsible for tilling the relational ground in our marriage to create an environment that is happy and safe for our wives to submit themselves under. So now we'll look at the second ingredient, the sacrificial, patient love of a husband. Paul continues in Colossians 3, verse 19, and he says this: "Husbands, love your wives and do not be bitter towards them." 3 things I want to pull out that is required of a husband's love. If you're taking notes, guys, jot these down. Number 1, a husband's love requires self-sacrifice. A husband's love requires what, guys? Self-sacrifice. The Greek word here, agape, again, a love that is in denying of oneself for the sake of another. It's the same kind of love that Philippians chapter 2 teaches us that Jesus gave to us when it says he left his heavenly abode, he stepped out of heaven into earth to take on the form of a bondslave or take on the form of a servant in order to reach his bride. And that is the attitude that a husband should have in his marriage. That I am going to be willing to step out of my world, to step into hers, to become her servant in order to see her thrive, in order to see her blessed. Ephesians 5 tells us, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. That's a tall order if I ever heard one. You mean in the same way that Jesus gives himself for me, gave his life while I was still a sinner, that is how I'm supposed to love my wife? Absolutely. Think about it. We are the church, the bride of Christ. Sometimes we're not a very beautiful bride. Sometimes we are not a very worthy bride. But despite all of our imperfections, all of our weaknesses, and all of our failures, Jesus still demonstrates his love to us, his grace to us, his undying mercy to us. And just as Jesus did for us, husbands, listen, there will be times in your marriage where you will have to take responsibility for stuff that is not your fault. Just be okay with it already. Absorb as Jesus absorbed. For just like Jesus, sometimes your bride's healing comes at the expense of your pain, and that is the way it ought to be. Loving like Jesus as a husband requires self-sacrifice. I am willing to give of my stuff, my life, my desires, my world, to step into hers. Secondly, the love of a husband requires patience and understanding. Patience and understanding. Husbands, when you get married, there is no doubt that your wife is going to bring into your marriage some blind spots. She's a person. She's a human being who might have gone through emotional damage or pain from the past experiences. She might be weaker than you in many areas. But just as your wife's submission to you is not based on your worthiness, but her worship to the Lord, your sacrificial love towards her is not dependent on her worthiness, but on your worship to the Lord. 1 Peter 3:7, Peter says this, "Husbands, likewise, dwell with your wife with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered." To honor the wife, literally it means to show deference or reverence for. That's what the word honor means. It doesn't mean I need to make sure we're even. It doesn't mean I need to make sure that if she's heard, then I need to make sure that I'm heard too. It means that I give, and I give, and I give in patience, in understanding, in order to honor my wife. I wouldn't recommend necessarily the Amplified Bible for your regular reading times, but I love the way it describes this verse. The Amplified Bible says, "You husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, that is, with great gentleness and tact, and with an intelligent regard for the marriage relationship." Think about it. Use your mind. Engage your wife as with someone who is physically weaker, since she is a woman. Guys, we have to learn to look past responses we don't like that come across disrespectful to us. And we have to learn and understand that there is often a deeper area of our wife's heart that is crying out to us. You guys, when your wife approaches you and you don't like how she approached you, you don't like how she spoke to you, you don't agree with her perspective, you know what's really happening? It is your wife from the deepest part of her heart crying, saying, "I need you to love me in my weakness. I need you to be willing to see past my insecurity. I need you to understand that beneath the surface of what you see, there is a deeper issue that I need you to hear, and I need you to affirm, and I need you to understand and seek to let me know that you understand about and caring about the deeper things that are going on in my heart." Am I close, ladies, a little bit? Yeah. I found that many men are just short and quick-tempered with their wives as soon as their pride gets injured a little bit. "How dare you speak to me like that? What about me?" Rather, the scripture tells us we ought to be patient, showing honor, and recognizing, Peter even tells us that if we don't, it is our own prayers to the Lord that are going to be hindered. I love how Matthew Henry describes the role and the place of a woman in her husband's life. He says this, "The woman was taken from Adam's side, not from his head to rule over him, not from his feet to be trampled on, but from his side to be of equal value, from under his arm to be protected, and from close to his heart to be loved." So a husband's love requires self-sacrifice. A husband's love requires patience and understanding. Number 3, and finally, a husband's love requires maintaining a soft heart towards your wife. Notice, and I think this is very interesting, Paul ends Colossians 3:19 by saying, "Do not become bitter at them." Now, I think interesting. Why would Paul write to guys not to become bitter with their wives? Probably because it's a natural tendency for husbands to become bitter with their wives. and bitterness builds walls. And guys, I think we can honestly say that sometimes it's easy for us to become bitter if we feel like our wife doesn't respect us, if she's talking down to us, or if she doesn't trust us. Our tendency is to distance ourselves from the relationship. But here's an exhortation, men. God has not called you to leave. He's called you to lead. Proverbs chapter 27, verse 8 tells us, like a bird that wanders from its nest is a man who wanders from his place. And a man's place in his marriage is to be loving and engaging his wife, even at the detriment of his own self. The response of most husbands when facing a conflict in their marriage is to ignore it and distance themselves by pouring their passions and energies into other things that inflate their ego. That's what guys do. If I'm not feeling respected at home, if I don't feel like I'm affirmed at home, I will find something else that I can pour my time and energy into that will make me feel affirmed, that will make me feel accepted. But guys, listen, when we start to feel that sense of resentment or bitterness growing in our hearts toward our wife, the best thing to do is first to run to the Lord in repentance of our own sin, and then run to our wives to reconcile things with them. Not to run to the TV or to the golf range or to our buddies or, God forbid, the girl in the office that just thinks you're the best. I've also learned that instead of getting bitter at your wife, maybe when you start to feel those things, it's a great opportunity, husbands, to just be able to take a look in the mirror. And why do I say that? Earlier, I exhorted women to be mindful of how you speak to your husbands. But I found something incredibly convicting in my years as a husband. Husbands, sometimes the expressiveness of your wife that comes across to you as disrespect is actually stemming from a greater and legitimate hurt that was actually caused by you. Chances are, there might be some ways you have neglected your role in leading and loving and cherishing your own wife that has caused her to get to the point where she feels like she needs to verbally express. Or maybe I could just simply put it like this. Sometimes your wife is a mirror that simply displays a reflection of your own failure in love and leadership. Oh, you think you're mad at your wife. You know what? You might actually really just be mad at yourself because you created that environment. It was your lack of love and care and gentleness and patience that created an environment where she just doesn't feel safe. She doesn't feel like she can communicate. She doesn't feel like she can thrive, and it's expressing itself in this way. It's not an excuse by any means. Sometimes it's just a result of your wife's humanity or her sin. But guys, it's a good opportunity for us to look at how we're cultivating our home, our marriage. What kind of environment have I created for my wife? It's very convicting at times to look at it that way. But when we look at these things, we clearly see how God gives us this prescription of how to love one another within the context of our marriages. So guys, this morning, maybe it's time for us to look at the quality of love in our relationships. Is my love selfless? Is my love patient? Is my love carried with a soft heart that is not growing bitterness? Or is my love selfish? Is my love hard-hearted? Is my love impatient? And ladies, wives, maybe this morning, maybe you're challenged that your love has not been shown in the way you've respected your husband, spoken to your husband, trusted your husband's leadership. Maybe there are little areas where you recognize, man, I've probably been harder on him than I need to be, or man, maybe I haven't given him reason to want to communicate with me in the way I wish he would. And maybe we can all do some self-evaluation into our own lives and into how we're practicing our own roles as husbands and wives today. You know, there are a lot of reasons why it's vitally important. A lot of reasons why it's vitally important to love your spouse. It provides a safer environment for your children. It's an investment into their future marriage. It brings intimacy and companionship to your life. It brings value and joy to each person. But let me just close with this. The most important reason that you should love your spouse in these kind of ways is because Ephesians 5 tells us that your marriage is a picture of the love that Jesus has for his church. And when you love your spouse in a biblical, Christ-like way, you are showing them the love of Jesus. You are showing your kids the love of Jesus. You're showing your neighbors the love of Jesus. You're even showing yourself the love of Jesus. And of course, this means when we're selfish and unkind and brash and impatient and rude, I'm not merely sending a message to my spouse that I think this way about them. I'm sending them a message and distorting the picture of the love of Jesus Christ. And so this is vitally important. And if we're challenged this morning, of course, we could do an 8-week series on this. I realize that I skipped a lot of really good stuff. But at the core of it, I think these are two very important ingredients. The affectionate, respectful love of a wife for her husband, and the sacrificial, patient love of a husband for his wife. With Christ in the middle, you will see marriage really begin to thrive. So there might be some hurting folks in here today. There might be some people who feel like their marriage is barely keeping their head above the water. If you find yourself the person like you're nudging this person, like, come on, it's you. It's you. Well, maybe it's them, and maybe it's you, and maybe it's both of you. Let's take some time to self-evaluate for the sake of our families. And ask God for grace and strength that we might know the love of Christ in our marriages. Amen. Let's pray.